right? How do we deal with that, right? So technically, how we can work with them. So how to configure and define the API for managing the requests, right? Next, after understanding this API, how to configure it and deal with this. Now we need to consume this in our Angular application and handle interaction from the Angular application. So server side and all basics we discussed. Now we need to do that. So here integration, how it works actually. So for that, you need to know two more options actually. So here in this design, yeah. So how we can consume by using Angular. Our API is ready, handling the requests. We tested that already. Now, how we can manage and access this. So let's see. So now how we can handle in our Angular. For that, actually, we need two important things. So generally, how we can work with um, the consuming of APIs in Angular application. Generally, even JavaScript also can do it. JavaScript, jQuery, they can also consume. Early days, everything, even today, many applications still use them. So how Angular makes more utilizing of libraries and handles them. So for that, Angular uses two important things. Angular application uses a JavaScript library RxJS. It uses a JavaScript library RxJS, and it uses RxJS for handling asynchronous calls, asynchronous events, handling asynchronous events. And Angular application uses HTTP client module. It uses HTTP client module that provides the properties and methods, that provides the properties and methods required for handling handling requests from API actually, from API. So technically, so we need two basic things here. One is RxJS, another one is a HTTP client module. So these two are required for dealing with integration with Angular actually. Generally, one of the advantages Angular is integrated with RxJS library. It is integrated with RxJS library. So technically, Angular is integrated with RxJS library. So usually, RxJS is a separate JavaScript library. There are so many JavaScript libraries like jQuery, RxJS, like we have the library called JQLite. All these are RxJS libraries only. They are used in different occasions, different situations. Now, RxJS is not a topic of Angular. RxJS is a library which Angular is using, integral part. It is using because it asks the developers to handle the asynchronous operations by using RxJS instead of going with traditional events. That makes better in the performance of application. So RxJS is not a topic of Angular. RxJS is used everywhere where JavaScript is used, right? So we should not relate it with only Angular. It's a separate library. So people can learn about this library individually and they can implement in JavaScript, jQuery, and whatever JavaScript based environments they are working on, they can implement there. So Angular, actually they have to explicitly install RxJS and use RxJS in their projects. Explicitly they have to do that. So, but Angular implicitly comes with RxJS. That is the point. So here we are using this library and we will learn how to use this library. I am not teaching RxJS library to you. I am showing you how to use this library in Angular for integrating and working with asynchronous calls. In our examples, we will implement whatever needed for API requests. We will do that. It's a separate JavaScript library. And HTTP client module is provided by Angular for handling the requests for API. So which we will see how it can manage. So actually what RxJS requires in RxJS, what you need to know as a basic learner about it, some points I will tell you, and we will implement that. We will see how it is going to work actually. So what is this RxJS and how this RxJS usually handles everything? Technically, as I already told you, so RxJS is a JavaScript library, JavaScript library. So it is used for configuring asynchronous events. Asynchronous events. It is used for configuring asynchronous events. That is the main intention actually. Generally, RxJS technically how it works, what it contains, I will tell you. Basic points, we will see that. So generally, what is the concept of asynchronous? Actually, asynchronous is nothing but asynchronous in RxJS especially is a collection of events. Technically, it is a collection of events. So that are executed. So asynchronous in RxJS is a collection of events that are executed. So with the non-blocking technique. So non-blocking technique actually. Blocking technique. It is executed using non-blocking technique. Actually, what is non-blocking technique means? So usually what happens is generally in asynchronous calls, what will happen is, suppose we are configuring some details. So suppose we have some collection. Collection can be anything. Collection of values, collection of functions, anything. Here RxJS is about both collection of values and functions actually, dealing with collection of values and functions. Suppose we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like this, 7 like this, collection of options are there. Now here, so what we need to do is we need to configure the interactions. We need to configure the interactions. So what we done is we have to pull the details on suppose a button click. On a button click, we need to request all. We need to read all. So we need to read all. Then what happens is, so these all are defined as a collection. all defined as a collection. And we need to manage all these from the collection. We need to configure all this, right? So we need to configure all this. Then what happens actually is a request is made for the first one. After making a request for the first one, it will wait until the response comes from the first one. That means a response should go from the first one. So once the response is returned from the first one, the response is ready. When the response is returned from the first one, then it will go to read the second one. So similarly, after response came from the second one, then it will go for the third one. This is a blocking technique. That means you have collection of functions, but all are not executed at once. So they are executed one after another. Generally, in single page application environment, we need in such a way that all functions will execute, and whichever function is ready, it returns the result first. That means in a non-blocking technique, it makes a request for first one. After that, it will not wait for response. It will go to second, after that third, after that fourth, after that fifth. So it will not wait for the response. Whichever response is ready, that response will be rendered to the client. So that means the lightweight response, whichever is ready, that is rendered back to the client. That's what generally happens, especially generally happens when you are dealing with technically when you are dealing with this. That means asynchronous library. That's what generally happens with asynchronous library. Now, we use this regularly everywhere. That means we use this asynchronous library everywhere. So we use this asynchronous library everywhere. So any JavaScript based environment can work and can use this asynchronous library. It can use that asynchronous library. So technically, we need to understand what is actually the purpose and how do we deal with that and all. What are required for us, we will see that. That is what we call this as non-blocking technique. So Angular prefers this kind of approach in handling the functions, in handling the events. That is the reason integrally, so it provides you this library, and it is not a part of Angular. That's the reason whenever you look at the Angular version, you will see that RxJS version is some 6 version or 5 version. So whereas Angular is 10 version and 9 version and 8 versions, because RxJS doesn't belong to Angular. So it is a separate library you are using in Angular, just for the sake of making your tasks asynchronous, handling the tasks asynchronously. Actually, RxJS, so that means ReactiveX actually, ReactiveX. The RxJS concept is ReactiveX. It is a concept of ReactiveX. Reactive extension for JavaScript actually, that is ReactiveX. And ReactiveX actually uses a pattern, uses software design pattern. It uses software design patterns, design patterns like observer. It uses design patterns like observer, and iterator. It uses the main functionality completely depends on observer and iterator. RxJS uses a software design pattern, uses software design patterns called observer and iterator. Technically, what is observer and what is iterator? Already one occasion I told you, observer is actually software design pattern. It is a software design pattern. I told you already, events follow a pattern called observer. So generally, if until or unless anybody tells you about that, you will not get an idea about this word observer. But actually you heard about this observer earlier itself. When we learned about events, I told you, events follows a software design pattern called observer. That means it uses a delegate mechanism, function pointer mechanism. So observer specifies, means it is a communication pattern. It defines how to communicate with the function. So RxJS, the primary patterns used in RxJS are two. One is observer, which is a communication pattern, which is used for handling communication, and which is mostly used by events, and iterator. Iterator belongs to collection, reading the values from a sequence, so sequential order without using any conditions and all. So that means reading the values and executing the communication with the functions, configuring communication with the functions. These are the primary things of RxJS actually. So RxJS primarily work with two things. One is observer and iterator. Already I told you what is an observer pattern in software design patterns. So observer is a software design pattern. Observer is a software design pattern. Technically, it is a software design pattern. So that means actually it is a communication pattern. So communication pattern. So under behavioral patterns. Under behavioral patterns, it is a communication pattern actually. Observer is a communication pattern. So it actually notifies the changes. It is responsible. I told you already, event users. So observer is a event users observer pattern actually. Event users observer pattern. That point I already told you once. So when, until or unless anybody tells that observer, so because RxJS uses this observer term very much, so generally people think that this is one option in RxJS. So actually it is a general thing, not only in RxJS, it is a observer is a common thing in software design. Now actually what is observer pattern is, it is a communication pattern. It notifies the changes to the object. It is usually used by event. It notifies the changes. So technically RxJS entire asynchronous programming are managed. So by using few components, that means the RxJS components, required for Angular, actually RxJS components required for async programming, RxJS related options required for async programming. We have few important components. So what are those components actually is, in RxJS, you will hear about few important components. So the component and the description, let's take a description about the component and description. Actually, so you will come across with a component called observable. You will come with a component called observable, come across with this observable. Actually, observable is technically, so it represents a collection of values in events. So technically it is a collection of values and events to be executed in asynchronous way, So what is observable in RxJS? Technically, it is a collection. It is a collection of events and values. It is a collection of events and values. Or you can say events or values. It is a collection of events or values. That means these events. So these events are intended to use on asynchronous calls. These events are used in calls. They are intended to use on asynchronous calls. So a set of events or set of values which are intended to get on asynchronous. That means events are invoked so on asynchronous technique, using asynchronous technique. That means events are invoked. So using asynchronous technique, events, you can say events are invoked using asynchronous techniques, async techniques. Events are invoked by using asynchronous techniques. That is the first point. Another important thing you should know is, so values are accessed by using async technique. That means if you have a collection of values, to access the values using async techniques, and to access the events or invoke the events by using async techniques, you need an observable. Observable is a collection of values or events. It is a collection of values or events. So technically, so these values and events so are using asynchronous calls. Suppose I have some set of values. So these values need to be delivered. So in this diagram, so this is a collection of values. You can have collection of values or collection of functions. There can be some functions like 5 is a function, like 6 is a function, like 7 is a function. And these 1, 2, 3, 4 are values, and 5, 6, 7 are functions. We need to execute them in a synchronous way. That means we configure these and we keep this as an observable. We keep under observable. We keep this on observable. It's so technically what is observable? It is a collection of events or values that are intended to run on asynchronous calls. So if you want some set of functions or values to work on asynchronous calls, we keep them in an observable. Okay. Next, you will come across with observer. Actually, observer is nothing but, so this observer, as per the software design pattern, so technically as per the software design pattern, so observer is a communication concept. That means it tells how to communicate with the observable. It tells how to communicate with the observable, and how to communicate with observable, and how to access the values from the observable. So observer so specifies how the communication need to be handled, how the object communicates. That is important. Actually, I will show you here one simple. On one occasion, I already showed you. So if you remembered that software design pattern, I showed you about some various types of software design patterns actually. So these are behavioral patterns. Behavioral patterns actually in software designing, these are communication patterns. That means how an object communicates, how it handles the communication. That is communication patterns. And in these communication patterns, you will find a pattern called observer. You will find a pattern called observer. Usually you can see a pattern called observer. So this is observer pattern. So it comes under the behavioral patterns. Actually, it is a way of notifying change to number of classes. That means it is handling communication. It is telling. So that means actually the point about observer in RxJS is, you can simply say that it is a collection of callbacks that knows how to interact with the values for the functions delivered by observer. That means observer contains a set of callback functions. Callbacks are functions, a set of callback functions that knows how to communicate with the values and the functions which are delivered by observable. That means it is a callback, set of callbacks. That means it contains information that identifies the communication with the objects. So, and very important is it is using another point is it is using iterator. Iterator is sequentially access elements from a collection. Based on these two major design patterns, this entire RxJS library is designed. RxJS library is designed. Based on these two patterns only, the complete RxJS is designed. So technically, so what is observable? Technically, observable is nothing but it is a collection of observable is a collection of events or values. Who is observer? Observer is a collection of callbacks. Callbacks. So it is a collection of callbacks. Usually it is a collection of callbacks. And this callbacks knows how to listen to the values delivered by the observer. That means these callbacks knows how to. So they know how to listen to the values. Listen to the values returned by observable, right? How they are returned by observable. Actually, observer actually notifies. So notified with the changes. So it is notified with the changes. Technically, it identifies the changes. So, and very important is it is responsible for listening the values. So delivered by observable. So whatever the values delivered or returned by observable, those values are accessed by using an observer. So that means, so observable contains this, and our application needs so to execute this. Then what our application will do is actually our application will use an observer, and observer will start listening to the values that are returned. The observer is responsible for listening to the values that are returned as response by the observer. That means when you make a request to the observable, it is returning the values. And an observer is present in our application, which is listening to the values, which is identifying the values returned or values delivered by the observable. So observer is responsible for knowing about the type of values coming from the observer. So that means you can clearly say that. So it knows about the type of values delivered. So delivered by observable. That is what actually technically basically observer is. So we have observable, which contains collection of values and functions to execute on asynchronous calls. Observer, which is monitoring these values returned by the observable, right? These are the two important options. And we have another option called subscription. Actually, subscription is nothing but it represents, it is used to, technically you can say that it is used to execute an observable, and it is primarily useful for the execution and cancelling of observable. That means whatever the functions are there, whatever the functions are defined, whatever the functions or values are defined inside the observable. So we need to start executing those functions and values in the observable. That means, so that is managed by a subscription. Subscription represents execution of an observable, and it is useful for cancelling the execution. Whenever you don't need, you can cancel the execution. So that is what actually subscription is. We will learn about a subscriber. So subscription and subscriber. I will tell you 2 points, because observer and subscription, these two words, if you have concentrated on our events concept, we already learned about those two things. So if you remembered, I given you a definition about event. If you have seriously concentrated on event in Angular, we discussed that event in event follows a software design pattern. Technically, how I defined event, I said that event is a message sent by sender to its subscriber. If you remember that term, so event is a message sent by sender to its subscriber in order to notify the change. So event is a message sent by, this definition is there in your note. You can go through that. Whenever I started discussing about event, I given this definition to you if you remember. So generally, the terms observer, the terms observable, the terms subscriber, subscriptions, these are all general things actually. They are not RxJS. Actually, they are general software programming related concepts. Mostly you will come across while dealing with the events and all mechanisms, communication mechanism. So as I told you, event is a message sent by sender to its subscriber in order to notify the change. If you remember that, actually, so we have button, and the button have an on click. So or just we used click, button have a click event. So we called a button, btn click function is called. Btn function is pointed. I told you that it is called function pointing. Then this is actually, if you remember, this is actually the sender. This is actually the sender. And you have a subscriber. You have a subscriber. Subscriber is nothing but, subscriber is defined with a method. That means btn click, this is the subscriber. This sender sends a notification to the subscriber. And what subscriber will do? Technically, what subscriber will do, it is responsible for, executing this functionality. It is responsible for executing the functionality, or it is responsible for, if I return false, then it is responsible for canceling the execution. Canceling of execution usually happens if it can return false. Return false, then you can cancel the execution. So subscription is a general terminology. Subscription indicates that, so it represents the execution. It represents the execution of that event, and it is used in the canceling of execution. It can be used in cancellation of execution. So we use actually subscriber. We simply call as subscribe. We use subscribe. Later, I will show you the method, how we write it. Subscribe is a method. Subscriber is a component, and the subscription is a technique. Subscription is a technique. These all are important. That means subscription is a technique that represents the execution of an observable. It represents the execution of an observable. So technically, what is the role of subscription? Subscription is nothing but it is responsible for executing the observable. So it is responsible for executing the observable. So, and it is also responsible for canceling the execution. So these are the things the subscription can do. So the collection of functions and values are defined in an observable, and the communication, identifying what type of values are being returned, that is monitored by observer. and executing those functions so is done by subscription. That means you have some functions inside observable, and you have to execute those functions. Then you need a subscriber. A subscriber is responsible for executing the functions present in the observable. And another important we have in RxJS, we use operators also. Technically, we use operators. Operators are nothing but they are like functions. They are like functions. And these functions so enable the communication with collections. These functions enable with the collections. That means actually operators, observable handling communication, and operator actually it is operators actually operator operators means operators they are representing iterator pattern. Operators represent iterator pattern. Then what is the operators are representing iterator pattern? They are representing iterator pattern. What is the iterator pattern is nothing but these operators so are used for enabling technically functional programming, which are used for dealing with collections like maps, like filters, like other type of collections. So that means, so what operators will provide? So that means operators will provide, they represent an iterator pattern. So this is used in handling collections. So in application, this is used in handling collections in application. That means operations over collection is managed by operators. And it will have operators like, so example, the operators like map. So it have operator like filter, etc. Map, filter, concat, all these are the operators actually technically. So observable contains set of functions and values. Observer is responsible for monitoring the values returned by observable, but observable functions and events are not executed. Those are managed by subscription. A subscriber is responsible for executing the events present in the observable, iterating over the events and reading those events in a sequential order. So which are present in observable is done by operators. It is done by operators. So that means this is handled by operators. So these are actually, so the major options, these are actually the major options so required in our RxJS, especially working with Angular. However, so actually subject and schedulers are, but according to the situation we use in our Angular applications also. So technically subject is nothing but, so subject it is like event emitter. It is like event emitter. It is like event emitter. Subject is like event emitter. That means event emitter is nothing but it is responsible for emitting the value. It is responsible for emitting the value. It emits the value. It emits the value. So it emits the value on specific event. So it works as an event emitter. So to emit the values on specific event, we use this subject. We have schedulers. Schedulers are nothing but, so they are used to schedule the tasks. So that means schedule the tasks so that are performed asynchronously. Schedule the task. Actually, they use set timeout functions. Set timeout. So set timeout like functions. So if you know about JavaScript, Set timeout is used for scheduling. Set timeout, clear timeout, set interval, clear interval. These are the options that you have in JavaScript for defining scheduling. That means what it will do is it can keep technically it can keep the functions, right? So technically it can keep the task waiting for a specific duration of time. So in asynchronous calls, generally we need the task to wait for specific duration of time. So that is the reason we need that. So technically we need all this. So usually these are all the options. These are all the options required for RxJS. These are all the basic options required for RxJS. Internally, they have so many things used, like they use functions, they use generators, they use promises, they use inspectors, they use so many other things internally so many things will be there, right? Technically, internally so much. It is a very big library. RxJS is a very big library. So many people just come to Angular and they think that, okay, RxJS is one topic in Angular, right? It's a general JavaScript topic actually. So the main intention of this is to configure JavaScript with asynchronous techniques. That is the key point here. And for that, so much is there. And one important is Angular is integrated with this library because Angular's main intention is to handle asynchronously, handle the options asynchronously. That is the main concept is using of RxJS, right? And for that, we need all these options. So technically, we need all these options and we have to work with all these options. So you will see in different ways how to use them and implement them in our application. So this is one library that we need for working with RxJS library. You don't need to install this library. This is already there. So it comes with Angular. So even you generally can download this library. So through NPM, you can download this library for your JavaScript and you can use that library in your JavaScript projects also. So it is not so for Angular, it is everywhere, right? That is the key point here. So what is the purpose? How to use this in our example, I will show. We will see that. How we can use and how we can manage that, we will see. Internally, it contains so many other things which we will use according to the situation also. Internally, it uses several other things like, so it has operators, so which will handle exceptions like catching the error, throwing the error. So many internal options are there, which we will see. So the core library is RxJS, which contains the basic components of this. Now, so this is for managing asynchronous calls, especially when you are communicating with API-like services. These are very much required. If anyone asks like, what is the best example for this? What is the best example for this asynchronous calls in real-world application? For example, the best example in real-world application is suppose we have WhatsApp. So in WhatsApp, you are currently offline. So when you are offline, one of your friend sent some messages to you. And in those messages, actually, so you have first message. So the first one was a picture. First one was a picture. And the second message was a video. So video. And third message was a text. These three messages he sent to you. Now, what happens is when you are offline, you are not online. So you are now online. When you are online, as per the presiding order, so that means at what time they sent it. That means they sent at 7:10 p.m. So they sent at 7:15 p.m., 7:12 p.m. like this. So now what happens is, so first question here is, when when you are online, will you receive all the three messages at a time? Actually, WhatsApp will load all offline messages, messages at will push, actually, not load. So that means it will push all messages at a time. It will push all messages at a time. All messages will be pushed at a time. But you will able to see the text first. Text first appears, and the picture is loading. Picture is loading, and video is also loading. Video also loading. That means it is not waiting. If it is not using asynchronous, first it should wait for picture to load. Once picture loaded, completed, then it should wait for video to load. Once video completed, then it should show your text. But you will see that text is already there, but picture and video above are still loading. That means all are pushed at a time. But which one you will see first depends on the size of that content, the type of that content. This is what actually RxJS is doing in the background. That means it is managing the asynchronous calls, asynchronous options. For this reason, we generally use RxJS. I hope everyone understood that point. So that is the concept of RxJS in real world applications, how it manages, right? And this is done by using this kind of libraries, RxJS like library. So that is generally, so we need RxJS. Another important library you need here is a HTTP library. We need a HTTP client library. HTTP client library. So we need HTTP client library in Angular for handling communication. And what is the purpose of this HTTP client library? That means what is the intention of this library? In Angular, what it is doing actually. So actually, Angular uses HTTP client module. Angular is provided with the HTTP library. Is provided with HTTP library. So it is technically provided with HTTP library. So which you can access. So by using HTTP client module, you can access by using HTTP client module. Actually, it provides a set of properties and methods that are used to make an HTTP request from client. So that means, so Angular provides, so, or you can simply say that the HTTP client module provides a set of properties and methods. It provides a set of properties and methods that are used by client-side application to handle communication. So communication with server side API, to handle communication with server side API. It provides all the options that are responsible for server side API. Actually, it internally uses XML HTTP request object. It internally uses XML HTTP request object of JavaScript. It uses XML HTTP request object of JavaScript. Actually, this is the object which is native to browser. So browser provides an XML HTTP request object. And this object is going to provide all the options to handle interaction with the APIs, actually. XML HTTP request object. That means actually it provides that object. Technically, suppose I am creating a script here. So script here function. So just a function is defined. Yeah. So where obj is equal to or where HTTP is equal to. So new XML HTTP request. This is HTTP request object. So this is an XML HTTP request object. So I said, where property in HTTP. Where property in HTTP. So I said document.write document.write. So property, we are printing the property. That means we are printing the properties of this option. So we are printing the properties of this HTTP, XML HTTP request object related properties we are printing. And when I'm printing those properties, you can see these are all the properties. These are all the properties. You can see this is the HTTP request object. And the HTTP request object is the object which is managed, which is responsible for handling all the requests. Actually, this internally provides options like on ready state change, ready state, so upload, so response URL, so status text, status text, response type, response text, HTML, open, send. These are the options which are used to send an HTTP request, so to access the data and fetch the data and use the data. So that means to communicate with so the APIs. It is used for communicating with the APIs actually. So JavaScript uses this object, and this is what actually generally people call this. This is the object which is used for AJAX. That means JavaScript uses this object for AJAX. AJAX is there in JavaScript also. AJAX is there in JavaScript also. Technically, we have this in JavaScript also. Now, only the point here is, so it is the primary object which is used. All other objects are using the same actually. All other client-side technologies are using the same object internally, but not directly. Right? They have a explicit library. Finally, this have to use this concept only. So it has to use this concept. That means actually it depends on browser. So AJAX calls how they are managed and what are the various options here. And you see the properties written here. That means so these have the methods. So these have the properties and these have the methods. So that means suppose we have a method called send. Actually, the purpose of this send method is technically it sends a message. It will send a message. That means you can simply say that it sends a request to the server. Mostly it is used for get, how we can handle the get. People in short, they call it as XHR also. The people call it as XHR. That means XML HTTP request actually. So this send function, these are all functions actually, send function. So this sends the request, it will fetch the request. Open is used for opening any file. Response text will return the text. Response text is returning, actually it returns the data as a response. That means whatever response comes for a request, that is returned by using this, right? So that means you make a request to API. When you make a request to API, the response will come. So the response will come. So and the response data contains a lot of details, like response contains status, response contains status text. So is it 404 or which one? And the response contains data. Data is returned by using this response text. Different technologies so use different techniques. Different technologies use different techniques in the client side actually. So we can use even open method to handle specific request and to specify the request and to fetch the data. So actually open uses, you can see here. So http.open, open is a method. This open method uses, so you can see that it uses the method, means which method from which URL, and it is using an asynchronous. So that means callbacks, asynchronous callbacks. That means is it true or false? So successfully data is coming or not. So this is a general thing actually. And this is all used by JavaScript, jQuery everywhere. Actually, it uses JavaScript. Generally, jQuery uses Ajax and get JSON like methods, get JSON like methods to handle. So this, but internally they also use XML HTTP request object only. So they also use XML HTTP request object internal. Whereas AngularJS uses, so because we are derived from AngularJS uses, so AngularJS actually uses $HTTP. This also using an XML HTTP request object. And Angular uses HTTP client module, so which is also doing the same. That means in Angular application, especially when you are in the Angular application, suppose I will go into the Angular application somewhere here in our components, somewhere in the components TS file. So suppose we want some Angular here. We are dealing with some modules. That means we are configuring with components. Okay. Yeah. Suppose we are using HTTP client. HTTP client module. This HTTP client module is actually, we have to import that HTTP client module. We will see the hierarchy from where we do that. We will design an example for that. So here from Angular / common / HTTP. So this is HTTP. We are configuring this HTTP. And with this common HTTP, we can import that HTTP client. And we can create an object for HTTP client. So private some HTTP. So it is using HTTP client type. When I go to the definition of this HTTP client, you can see that this HTTP client is using, so technically it says that sends an HTTP request and returns a stream of HTTP events. That means, remember, here it returns a stream of HTTP events. HTTP events means it's a collection of some events. Then means it is returning an observable. That is the reason we use these observables very much regularly here, because it is returning a sequence of events. When it is returning a sequence of events, we have to collect the sequence of events. So it is requesting the data, it is handling the headers. So it has a lot of things doing by using observables. Observable means, I said that it is a collection. It is a collection of events. We don't need to go into this detailing, but just we need to know that why we need observable, why you need RxJS here. So why you need that library here? Because it is going to return a sequence of events. When it is going to return a sequence of events, we don't need to read all the events that it is returned. We need to read only the events that are needed for that situation and execute them. So asynchronously, we need to manage all the events. We need to manage the response data. We need to manage the response text. We need to manage the response status messages. Everything we need to manage that is made through that request. In that case, we need an observable. So that is observable. It returns an observable. That is the reason we need an observable to hold the data and keep the data. So why you need observable? So at high level, if anyone asks like, why do I need an observable while especially dealing with HTTP requests? Then one important answer for that is you need observable because your HTTP client module returns a set of HTTP events. It returns a set of HTTP events as a response for the request. And when a set of HTTP events are returned as a response to any request, then they need an observable to catch that and store that and process that and executing those events. So that is the reason we use observables actually. How to use observables we will see, but we need to know that. So we need this HTTP client module. And actually this HTTP client module, so it is defined, defined in, so Angular. So it is defined in Angular /common / HTTP. It is defined in Angular Common HTTP. We have to create an object. Through that, we can manage the request. That means syntactically, how we define is we create syntactically how you configure actually. Syntactically from our client-side application, we will create an object. So we will create an object that is HTTP object. It is of type HTTP client. It is of type HTTP client. So, and what is that intention here is through that HTTP, we can manage the request like GET. Through that HTTP, we can manage the request like POST. That means through this HTTP, we can manage that request HTTP.get. We can handle that. That means this dot HTTP. So HTTP.get. We can manage the GET request. We can manage the POST request. Now this is HTTP object. And this is of type HTTP client object. That means what is the purpose of this HTTP object and what that HTTP object does. So it is responsible for managing the request from the client. And very important is it is using GET. When it is using GET and it is getting from any specific URL, that means it is accessing. So the request, it will make to our URL. Our URL is temporarily, I will keep like, so HTTP colon. So 127.0.0.1:8080/get products. It will make like this. Now what it is going to return as a response? As a response, it is going to return a set of events. Those set of events actually comprises of all these things. Set of values and set of events, all are returned. Timeout is an event. So response text is a value, status text is a value, open is an event, send is an event. That means these are the methods actually. That means set of methods and set of values are written because it internally uses XML HTTP. Then the point is how you catch that. Set of values are coming, set of events are coming, values and events together coming, how you will handle it. That's the reason you can see that. Now this requires an observable. So generally we use an observable actually. We use an observable. So by using an observable, we can collect the data and define the data. And observable is present in RxJS. You have to import that RxJS and we can use that observable. Observable of what type that I will tell you. So I'm just explaining the point, how to write them and all we will discuss. Why you need that, that is the intention here. That is the point. And these are all general JavaScript based concepts only. So Ajax, and jQuery is using in a shorthand way and Angular is using in a more better way. That is only the difference. But finally, they have to use XML HTTP request object only for managing it, right? Technically, you need to understand this, how to manage and how do we work with that. So now what we need to do is, so we need to use this RxJS and HTTP client library. And by using that, we need to create a service that can consume the data from our database and submit the data to the database. So finally, how to present and interact in Angular application that we will see in tomorrow's session. Right, tomorrow we will finish the integration with server-side technology. That means we will create an example for reading and inserting the data. So that's enough to understand the complete process. Then we will discuss some authentications and securities, how they are managed. So tomorrow we'll continue with this, okay?